Well, good morning and welcome to our Anzac Day coverage in Adelaide. Neil Cross with you, and alongside me is my ABC colleague Emma Rebolado and of course the RSL ambassador Bill Denny. Well, Emma, each year brings into focus some significant memories and moments in the Anzac story, and of course this year's no different. In 2023 there are some major anniversaries.
Well, that's right. We have 70 years since the Korean War armistice. It's 50 years since Australia ended its involvement in the Vietnam War. It is also 20 years since the Iraq War began. We're also paying special tribute to those who have served in Afghanistan. Bill, each year we see the numbers of our World War II veterans shrinking with time, and I suppose that pulls into focus these other conflicts as well and the men and women who served.
Certainly in a physical sense, there is a much greater focus, Emma, on the contemporary veterans because they're here and they're marching. But Anzac Day is a holistic remembrance, a holistic commemoration, and the substance of the day will always be to remember the 103,000 Australians that died in the service of their nation and every single person that served.
Well, wherever you are, stay with us. We will have the march live. That's in about half an hour. But right now, let's go back to the start of the day, the dawn service from the National War Memorial on North Terrace. And we begin with the arrival of the Governor, Her Excellency Frances Adamson.
Namani, Nainari Ian Smith, Mani Nabudni. Good morning, Your Excellency and Mr. Bunton, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and everyone listening or watching at home. My name is Ian Smith. On behalf of the State President of the Returned and Services League, Mrs. Cheryl Cates, I welcome you to this dawn service. We are very pleased to have so many of you joining us here today. Nadlu Tapinthi, Nadlu Gana, Yatanka Imparinthi. The RSL acknowledges that this memorial is built on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and pays respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. We pay our respects to the first peoples of these lands, both past and present. Kia ora to our New Zealand comrades, represented here by Major Jean Fenton of the Ngāti Tuma Tawenga, the New Zealand Army, and Hoş geldiniz to the people of Turkey, represented by Ms. Tanya Kaplan from the Turkish Association of South Australia. A special welcome to Major Rick Clark, who is the guest of the RSL this morning, representing veterans of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. 100 years ago today, commemorative ceremonies and services were being held marking the 8th anniversary of the Gallipoli landing. Our first war as a nation, the Second Boer War, ended 121 years ago. Nearly 600 of the 16,000 Australians who served in South Africa died. From a population of less than 5 million, 331,000 Australians served overseas in the First World War, and 60,000 remain buried in foreign soil. 156,000 were wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. The loss and grief felt right across the country resulted in intergenerational trauma that is still felt today. This year marks the 80th anniversary of several Second World War battles against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. 1943 began with the capture of Buna and Senananda in New Guinea, followed by the Salamaua campaign, a significant Australian naval and air contribution to the Allied invasion of Sicily, and the torpedoing and sinking of the Australian hospital ship Centaur by a Japanese submarine with a loss of 268 lives, including 11 nurses. 70 years ago, immediately following the successful Australian defence during the Battle of the Samichon River, the Korean War armistice was signed, bringing a halt to a war that cost 340 Australian lives and 1,200 wounded, with another 16 dying in post-armistice ceasefire monitoring operations. 17,000 Australians served in Korea. 65 years ago, Anzac Day became a national public holiday, and 60 years ago, Australia's involvement in the Malayan emergency ended. This year marks the 55th anniversaries of Operations Coburg and the Battle of Coral and Balmoral during the Vietnam War, both of which involved significant Australian and New Zealand casualties. On the 11th of January 1973, Australian involvement in the Vietnam War ended. 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam, 523 lost their lives as a result of that war, and over 3,000 were wounded. A group of veteran organisations will be conducting a special commemorative service at the Vietnam War Memorial adjacent to the Torrens Parade Ground on the 18th of August to mark the 50th anniversary. This year is also the 30th anniversary of the conclusion of Operation Solace and the Australian commitment to the Unified Task Force in Somalia. Last week, those who served in Australian Defence Force elements committed to that operation were awarded the Meritorious Unit Citation, a long overdue recognition of their service. This was just one of over 100 peacekeeping and humanitarian missions Australians have served on since 1947. More than 700 members of the Australian Defence Force are currently serving on operations from border protection and peacekeeping to maritime security and assistance missions. This includes around 70 personnel deployed to the United Kingdom on Operation Kudu to help train the armed forces of Ukraine to defend their homeland. 20 years ago, Australia joined a United States-led coalition in the invasion of Iraq. Our commitment included 3 Navy ships, a Special Forces task group and a significant Air Force contingent, including patrol, refuelling, transport and fighter aircraft. After the successful conclusion of the invasion and toppling of the government of Saddam Hussein, Australian forces withdrew, only to return in 2005 to support and train Iraqi forces, a commitment that continued until 2009. In 2014, Australian forces returned to Iraq to support the military intervention against Daesh, also known as ISIS or ISIL, in Iraq and later in Syria. This included training and assistance tasks, a Special Forces task group, as well as an air task group conducting and supporting strike missions in support of Iraqi forces. The mission had been largely scaled back by 2020, although Australia maintained some personnel there. 5 Australians died as a result of their service in Iraq between 2003 and 2013, including 1 Australian serving with the Royal Air Force. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are part of our recent history. Their official history is still being written, and conclusions about our involvement in them and the impact on the world and our security are for others to draw. These are not matters for the Australians who were sent to fight them, and the merits or otherwise of our involvement in these wars should not reflect in any way on those who were sent. A fundamental part of being a member of the Australian Defence Force is that you do not decide where you are sent. The Australians that served in Afghanistan and Iraq stepped forward to serve their country with the same spirit of duty as that depicted on the front of this memorial. This morning, the names of those South Australians who died as a result of their service in Afghanistan are being unveiled on the principal memorial for all South Australians who have died as a result of their service on operations since the end of the Second World War, close alongside the names of those who died as a result of the First and Second World Wars. They are now where they belong. Anzac Day has a single focus: the commemoration of Australian and New Zealand veterans who offered and often sacrificed their lives in our name. It is the time we acknowledge that we are commemorating a willingness to serve and sacrifice for our land and its people. This applies as much to our young people currently serving on peacekeeping, border protection and other operations as it did to those that served in the First World War. It is also the time that we acknowledge that we have a duty as a society to support those who have lost loved ones to war and its aftermath, as each death leaves a trail of human heartbreak. We also have a responsibility to embrace our wounded veterans of all conflicts, some of whom are only just coming to terms with how their service has altered the path of their lives and those of their families. Sadly, this process can result in family breakdown and homelessness, and has seen hundreds of our veterans take their own lives in the last 20 years. So today we commemorate, we show respect, we honour and we give thanks. We remember the 103,000 young Australians who lost their lives defending our land, people and democratic way of life, and remind ourselves to show compassion for those that have emerged from their service bearing physical, mental, spiritual or emotional scars. Finally, remind those that we elect to represent us that they bear a great responsibility when they decide to send our young people to fight on our behalf. A responsibility that includes ensuring they are treated with respect and cared for properly when they return home. Last year, I had the privilege of meeting diplomat and singer-songwriter Fred Smith and listening to him perform his song Sapper's Lullaby. Fred wrote the song after witnessing the ramp ceremony for Sappers Darren Smith and Jacob Moreland following their deaths, along with Darren's explosive detection dog Herbie, in the explosion of an improvised explosive device in the Mirabad Valley of Afghanistan on the 7th of June 2010. Fred is touring Tasmania at present and is unable to be here in person, but he has generously given us permission to have his song performed this morning by guitarist and singer Greg Hart. Thanks, Greg.
The gate and out to the flight line. We stood in the sun, slouch hat and gun, as two caskets passed by. We followed the Padre onto the Herc and out to the pale summer sky. We walked back to Poppy's, then went back to work with the dust still in our eyes. So soldiers, sing me your sapper's lullaby. You give us your all, knowing if you should fall, that all good things must die. Those young engineers whose job is to clear the road so we may pass, they're always out front, and when they bear the brunt, man, it happens so fast. Sapper D. Smith had a wife and a son, the apple of his eye. Snowy Moreland was just 21, way too young to die. So soldiers, sing me your sapper's mother, call your old man on that welfare line. Tell him you love him while you still can, 'cause all good things must die. So soldiers, sing me your supper's lullaby. You give it your all, knowing if you should fall, that all good things must die. All good things must die.
I now introduce Chaplain Mike Barrett, who will lead us through the service.
The Lord's Prayer was written some 2,000 years ago, but there are many of us who are still familiar with it today. Many soldiers also, who fought in the First World War, would have known the Lord's Prayer by heart. And in the midst of the battlefield, of being overwhelmed and frightened, some of them would have recited it for comfort, for strength, and for peace. Let us do the same this morning. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Amen. This morning's reading will be from the book of Micah, a book which was written by an individual who desperately desired and longed for peace in his own homeland of Judah. This is what it says. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and people will stream to it. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations, far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. I would now like to offer a prayer of remembrance. God of love and peace, today we bring our thanks for the peace and the security that we enjoy. Today we remember all Australians and New Zealanders who served in the Army, Navy and Air Force during the First World War. Make us good stewards of the freedom which they won. We remember those of other nations who fought beside them and those who fought against them for their own countries. Bring us all to the day when nations no longer make war against other nations. We remember the physically wounded and the mentally scarred. We pray for healing, for peace, for their body, for their mind and spirit. We remember those who died in battle from their wounds, and those who took their own lives in agony or despair. God of peace, embrace them and comfort their families who remain. We remember the prisoners of war and those who sheltered and sustained them. We remember the mothers, the wives, sisters, children and sweethearts who prayed and grieved for the missing and the lost. God of love, we pray for the comfort of those who mourn. We remember the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander volunteers who fought for a nation that did not recognise them as citizens. lead us towards true reconciliation with Australia's First Peoples. We remember the homes, the livelihoods, and the communities which were destroyed by bombs and gunfire. Have mercy on all who still live in the shadow of war. Today, as we remember the terrible cost of this and every other war, renew us, in us, the longing for peace and the will to work for it, day by day, side by side. These things we bring before you today. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite our senior guests to place a wreath or tribute on the memorial. The first wreath and tribute will be placed by Her Excellency the Governor and Mr Bunton. Mrs Cheryl Cates, State President of the Return and Services League, Major Jean Fenton representing the New Zealand High Commissioner, Ms Tanya Kaplan representing the Turkish Association of South Australia, and Major Rick Clark representing those who served in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Honourable Peter Malinauskas MP, Premier of South Australia. Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, representing the Prime Minister. Senior ex-service and kindred organisations are now invited to place a wreath or tribute. The Naval Association of Australia SA Section, the Royal Australian Regiment Association South Australia, the Air Force Association South Australian Division, the Legacy Club of Adelaide and Australian War Widows. "20 years ago, the post-World War II memorial was dedicated with the names of 75 veterans who had enlisted in South Australia and died as a result of their service. Almost all of those 75 names were South Australians who had died in the Korean or Vietnam Wars. Last year, the RSL, in consultation with other veteran and kindred organisations in South Australia, decided to redevelop the memorial to include all veterans with strong connections to South Australia and Broken Hill who died as a result of Australian operations since World War II and are listed on the Australian War Memorial Roll of Honour. Subsequent consultation and research brought to light the names of a total of 25 additional veterans to add to the 75 already on the memorial, and they had died as a result of their service in the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, in Papua and New Guinea prior to independence, in the Korean War and during ceasefire monitoring after the armistice, in the Malayan Emergency and Far East Strategic Reserve operations, in the Vietnam War and the Indonesian confrontation, in air operations out of Ubon in Thailand during the Vietnam War, in Afghanistan, of course, on humanitarian operations in Indonesia after the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, and in the Greater Middle East. The following names have been added to the memorial: Douglas Roy Barker, Terry Jason Bryant, Glenn Ray Chaplin, Vern Grantley Cowan, Thomas James Dale, Matthew Peter Davey, William John Davis, Jeffrey Max Duro, James Halen, Dennis Keith Hoare, Alan Douglas Jelly, Wendy Elizabeth Jones, Jamie Ronald Larkham, Kevin Edward Lynch, Dennis James McCormack, Mark McGrath, Paul John McKay, Brenton George Mowbray, Brian Paul Pelgrave, Andrew Robert Russell, Kevin Damien Joseph Shoppy, Darren James Smith, Scott James Smith, John Darrell Tassell, and David John Waldock. I now invite Her Excellency and Major Clerk to unveil the memorial. Chaplain Barrett will now dedicate the memorial.
Let us remember before God and entrust into His embrace those who died for their country in war and in peace. Let us remember them today, those whom we knew, those whom we loved, and those whom we still love, and those whose memory we will always treasure.
I now invite Her Excellency Mr Bunton to place a tribute on the memorial. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Major Rick Clark to recite the Ode of Remembrance.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold to that which is good. Render to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honour all people. Love and serve the Lord, and rejoice in his Spirit. And may the blessing of God Almighty be with you and remain with you always. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now sing the national anthems of New Zealand and Australia.
Here we are.
And as promised, we are live and you are now watching the scene as the march begins. And Bill Denny, as usual, the police greys leading out.
Yes, Neil, they are, and there's a delightful link between the police greys and military service. While the South Australian Police used some greys from the 1800s, their use only became more prominent in World War I, and that was because all the darker coloured horses had been selected for military purposes and taken overseas, leaving only grey horses for the important police work. We sent 136,000 horses overseas for World War I duty, and only one returned, and that was the mount of General Bridges. General Bridges commanded the Anzac Corps at Gallipoli and lost his life there.
It is an absolutely glorious day in Adelaide today. The sun is shining, the crowds are here to pay their respects to those who have served, those who are no longer with us as well. So as we'll be seeing the march today, we will be seeing a specific order. We'll be seeing the Navy, followed by the Army, followed by the Air Force. You'll be seeing this order repeated right throughout the march, and this is the order of formation, which is why it is in this way. We are also seeing in certain sections of the march that flags will be lowered at certain points, and there will also be a salute to the Governor as they go past Her Excellency Frances Adamson.
Emma, older viewers might remember from the 1930s to the 60s, the march was led by a very impressive uniformed veteran on a striking dapple grey charger. He was indeed Colonel William Charles Nightingale Waite, and he was a Boer War veteran and a Gallipoli veteran, served the entire Gallipoli campaign and served on the Western Front. And he will be well known to older viewers, but he led his last march on his dapple grey charger, having led it on 29 occasions in 1965, and he was 85 sitting on astride that horse.
Extraordinary record, isn't it? And we'll see, as we know, the numbers of our World War II veterans, as we mentioned at the top of the program, that they are inevitably dwindling, and that's the first part of the march that we're going to see is with the Boer War and World War I banners. Obviously nobody's surviving from those wars, and the numbers are dwindling of what we know as the Great Wars, the World War I and World War II.
There's going to be about, you're right, Neil, there's going to be about, we think about 25 marches actually either being wheeled, or some of them will actually be marching on foot. But there'll be many more at home, and we think about them. And we think there's probably about 1,000 surviving in South Australia. There's the Governor. She's done such a wonderful job with veterans. She's embraced them and really made herself known and supported the veterans community. And indeed supported by her husband, Mr. Bunton, who has a link with the Australians. His father served in the RAF flying alongside Australians. He flew in 194 and 52 Squadron as part of Transport Command in England, and I know Mr. Rod Bunton is a great support to our veteran community, and we're pleased to have them both on our side.
So as you can see there, that's the band of the South Australian Police. Now this is traditionally what we always see at the beginning of Anzac Day March. We see the South Australian Mounted Police followed by the police band, and behind them the Grand Marshals. They are slowly making their way down King William Road.
The Grand Marshals, that's a symbolic position, Emma, that it's led by both serving and retired armed service officers in South Australia, and I think there's about 8 of them, 9 of them there today.
You see that sign there just behind, at the start of the march virtually, the New Zealand veterans, and that's something that we often, I guess, you overlook on Anzac Day, but the reason of Anzac is, of course, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps.
Well, that's right, and historically the New Zealanders are the guests of honour on these Anzac Day commemorations in Australia.
I see Silver's back there again. Silver's the gentleman, married gentleman with the beret and the stick. He was a regular marcher. I noticed he was missing last year, but he's back. Good to see you, Silver. There he is.
And we also have the flyover of the tiger moth, gypsy moth, and the chipmunk. There you can see them.
Flight leader Steve Jenkins in charge.
It's marvellous to think that some of the men on the ground in the Air Force contingent may well trained in those very aircraft. Then we've got Turkey, led by Tanya Kaplan, President of the Turkish Association of South Australia. And who can forget those immortal words from Ataturk that were mentioned again at our dawn service this morning, when he, Ataturk and his country, embraced all Australians killed at Gallipoli, saying that having died in his country, they had become our sons as well. A really keen and dedicated group in the Turkish Association do a whole lot of good work.
So behind that we have the World War I banner. And of course we remember all those people who served in these conflicts, particularly those who had a connection to South Australia.
We've got Legacy. Legacy is celebrating its centenary year this year, 100 years, great work, led by President Rob Ely, who served in the ADF. He was in the Navy and the Air Force for 40 years, and Rob's accompanied by, there you can see them, Legacy Youth, Harper and Lachlan. And Harper and Lachlan will lay a wreath at the Cross of Sacrifice at the conclusion of our march.
Not-for-profit charity, which is something to remember too. They do some great work and looking after widows as well and families.
Well, in fact, in South Australia, they support more than 3,000 widows and widowers, more than 104 children, and also more than 60 people with disability. And they also have quite a number of volunteers working for them, more than 330 legatees and volunteers doing some incredible work to support our veterans' communities.
The youngest of those children they're supporting is 2, and the oldest person they support is a widow, 108 years old.
It's just a reminder of the veteran or those who died in war and what could have been before them, long lives. Were they not to sacrifice themselves for Australia?
And also shows the sacrifice that families make too, doesn't it?
It does. Now we're coming into Group 2, and this is the World War II veterans, and it'll be led by Group 2 Navy. There were 54,660 South Australians enlisted for World War II, and as we said, that only about 1,000 survive, and maybe 25 here today. We've got the cruisers coming first, and that man right in the centre is Ron George, being pushed by his daughter Karen, and also next to him is I think George Lower, with his daughter pushing him. She's wearing a beret. Ron served on the Westralia when it came under kamikaze attack. He was also coxswain of a landing craft in landings in New Guinea and the Philippines and Borneo. He just turned 98, and George Lower, George will turn 102 next month. And this is his second only march. George was a sapper with the ship's army detachment on HMAS Manura. There's Ron. He's looking fitter by the year.
So this part of the march is, of course, for those who have served, and if they are accompanied by someone, by a carer, we will be seeing that as the march goes on. But later in the march, we'll be seeing descendants, and they'll be marching in honour of their loved ones. There we have the N-class destroyers.
There we are.
So Nizam, Napier, Nestor, Norman and Nepal.
That's right. We just, you mentioned HMAS Nepal, Emma. I recently learned that a sailor from Nepal, Mick Rooney, was the man that created the very first of those Anzac Day banners for the RAN units that march. That's a marvellous indirect contribution. Mick was a well-known character around Port Adelaide, and his name's on that Workers' Memorial down there. Now we have the corvettes. Roy Mingy is marching. On foot as usual. Roy's one of our youngest marchers at 97. He joined Bathurst in Bombay in 44, age 17, and went on to serve in the Maryborough and the Cessnock. He's marching in his own right, but in memory of his brother Ron, who served with 2nd 6th Cav Commando Regiment. And Ray Desmond is there. He's being wheeled. Ray's back with us after 3 years leave. His daughter Linda's wheeling him, and he served on the Goulburn. It's good to see you back, Ray. And we Sadly, we lost Cyril Jacobs of Waikerie throughout the year. He served on the Bundaberg and was a regular attendee at Anzac Day events, and we send our condolences to his family.
So now we have the 108 Tank Attack Regiment, formed at Warradale Armour Camp in 1941.
108 Tank Attack Regiment. And there's Harvey Brown being accompanied by his daughter Rebecca and son Steve. Harvey's 99 years old, there he is. He saw action in the Southwest Pacific on Moritai, finishing the war at Ambon. It's pretty fit for 99.
Well, it's not an easy day for the veterans either. I mean, for them it is a warm day.
It's a very warm day.
And it's a fair march that they're doing too.
Okay, so now we have the interstate units. So this association was formed in the 50s for SA-based ex-servicemen who served in interstate units in Australia and also overseas.
Colin Murray is there, being pushed by wheeled by his son Gary. Colin's 100 years old. He served one armoured division and went to Singapore at the end of the war to repatriate prisoners of war like our much-loved Bill Schmidt. Hello to Dean Hughes listening from Glenside, and we remember Murray Rich, who's passed. And there we see, under the Ordnance banner being wheeled, is our good mate Laurie Gillespie with the cap on there. Laurie's being wheeled by grandson Simon. He served in Darwin, Port Moresby and Lay and rose to the rank of sergeant, and Laurie will be 100 in December. I know Laurie well, he's a good bloke.
He's having a good day out by the looks.
Yep. Australian Electrical Mechanical Engineers. There's Ron Butterfield with the Akubra and the sunglasses and the wheelchair. He's been wheeled by the family, by his son Rodney. Ron will turn 101 in November. Ron served in the engineers as a part of 102 Brigade, and he saw service in the Southwest Pacific. Australian Women's Land Army. Like to send the best to Irene Dixon, listening from Port Elliot. Irene was a member of the Australian Women's Land Army and provided essential support on farms. She turned 100 last November, and it was a 3-day event.
As it should be.
As it should be, yeah. Now we're moving on to the women's, the Royal Australian Air Force, led by the Women's Australian Auxiliary Air Force. And Ray Harris and June Hunter, regular marchers, leading the contingent.
And more than 27,000 women enlisted and served in a lot of dangerous areas, performing nursing, admin, signals, radar, driving, plenty of other roles too.
Yeah. And now would be a time to special mention for our much-loved Thelma Zimmerman, also known as Queen Thelma. Thelma was an ornament to our march for many years, and we lost her 7 weeks ago, aged 100. She served as the lieutenant. Thelma was so proud of the contribution made by her family during the war. Her husband served, as did her brother Sid Kinsman. Indeed, Sid was a rat of Tobruk, a veteran of the Second Battle of El Alamein, and taken prisoner of war by the Italians and then the Germans. He then managed to escape. Quite an extraordinary record. And Thelma would want me to mention the service of her sister Jean, who rendered equally valuable service out of uniform in the munitions production industry.
So the RAAF signals and radar we've got there. It's so wonderful to see so many people out today to pay their respects, to thank those who have served and are still serving.
We're coming up to the RAAF in World War II, and I'm expecting to see Lyle Ellis marching today on foot with his daughter Christine. We'll have to look for him. Sadly, in the last year, we've lost some RAAF people. Norm Ginn of Victor Harbour, what a great man he was, who flew in Bomber Command and was taken prisoner of war when he was shot down. Also hope to see Robert Rankin here, who was served in signals and radar. What's that? What?
What is happening is it's
Southwest Pacific.
as the numbers go through very, very quickly, it's hard to get to everybody because there are so few of our veterans, of course, left from this theatre of war.
There's the Southwest Pacific Air contingent. Looking for Lyle Ellis. Yes, Lyle's there, being wheeled by his daughter Christine. Lyle was a flight lieutenant, did 2 tours of New Guinea. Lyle promised me he'd be marching, and he's in that chair. Lyle let me down. Lyle was a flight lieutenant, did 2 tours in New Guinea. First on Boomerangs with 4 Squadron, second on Kitty Hawks with 78 Squadron. He will turn 100 later this year. Also looking for Robert Rankin now. We should be able to see Robert when he comes along because he's promised to be in his RAAF uniform. He'll be wheeled by his daughter Megan. There he is. Robert joined the Air Training Corps at 16 and did all his training as a wireless air gunner. He was just about to deploy overseas and the war ended, which I think was a blessed release in one way, but I'm sure he would have been disappointed. That's the signals and radar people. We had 2 radar stations operating during World War II. One was at Cape Jervis and the other at Wedge Island, and they operated as part of a national network of stations to maintain surveillance over local shipping lanes. Now we've got the British Armed Forces. There's Chook.
Keith Fowler, one of our absolute favourites.
Cummings, there he is. Keith Fowler, one of our, as you said, one of our absolute favourites. Keith is a 102. He's standing there with his hand above his head. And Keith, 102 and 4 months. He wouldn't mind me admitting that he's not well. He admits to everybody, it was in the paper, he's got stage 4 cancer. He's there with his son, Robert, and he's also marching with his great mate's son. That's the gentleman with the next to him with the medals on the right-hand side. That's Andrew Thomas. Jack Thomas, who died a couple of years ago, was Andrew's dad, and he was a great mate of Chook.
And for Chook, it was incredibly important for him, even though he is, as you said, unwell, incredibly important for him to be able to walk past the governor to pay his respects. What an amazing man. I met him not long ago and I was a fangirl. I was waiting for my moment to meet him. I was so excited. He's such an incredible man, generous, kind, and very, very funny.
He says, while I can, I must. And at 102 with stage 4 cancer, he gets up every morning, goes around his retirement village, picks up the papers for the widows and takes them and makes sure they're put on their front doormat.
And he did stop the march then.
He did.
He did.
He stopped the march so he could do what he wanted to do.
Now we've got the Group 2 transport, and we've got a number of people here. In the minibus was Ron Bridgman and Di Watson. We've got Ray Merrill, who's there in the Jeep. And we've also got Angus Hughes, who's in the RAAF staff car. There it is. Angus Hughes is an extraordinary record. He flew 32 missions in Bomber Command and shot down on his 32nd, captured by the Germans, and spent the last year of the war in the prisoner of war camp. The last time he marched was in the 1950s, he tells me. He flew with 467 Squadron and was shot down on the night of 26th of September 1944.
And Ron Bridgman, who you mentioned earlier, his family's been in touch with us as well. So he survived the bombing of Darwin and he did everything he could to be here today.
He was in one of those minibuses. Malcolm Hunt was also in a staff car. Malcolm flew as a mechanic in Catalina's out of Port Moresby. There's Chook, back to Chook. Yes, while I can, I must. He is just the last of 800 men. He's fought in Syria, Then the unit, the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, was brought back to Australia because the Japanese were approaching us. They decided to meet the Japanese in Java, so they stopped there. Unfortunately, the second ship carrying their machine guns didn't stop, so poor old Chook and all his mates from the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion fought a valiant for a couple of battle for a couple of days in Black Force under Arthur Blackburn before they had to give themselves up to the Japanese. We remember people like Bill Schmidt, Bluey Stevens, Ron Gratz, and their mates from the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, and all the people from that association who do such a good job keeping the story of their parents and their members alive, and looking after people like Chook.
And for people like Chook, it's not just important to march for themselves, but also to march for all of their mates who are no longer here, isn't it?
Chook says, Emma, I was just a digger, right? I wasn't important, but here I am now, and he can't get over. He was awarded the Order of Australia Medal this year, but he says, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure my mates are remembered. And that's stage 4 cancer, 102 years and 4 months. That's grit. That is grit.
Well, he's only wanting to get out of his chair for the governor, effectively, and he's decided, I'm feeling good, so
and
I'll
at a cracking
keep going.
pace too.
He did say. Here we are. He did.
There he is.
Yeah, old Chook.
So behind Chook we have BCOF, Korea, Malaya, Borneo and Navy Vietnam veterans.
We must remember and acknowledge that dear man, Dr. Don Baird, who served with British Commonwealth Occupation Force and went on to render distinguished service in Vietnam. Such a gentle, kind soul. You wouldn't find a better man. And his loss during the year has been felt by us all. We send our deep condolences to wife Margaret. We also lost Teddy Lynch recently, who served in British Commonwealth Occupation Force, and we send our condolences to Cherie. They're leading in Korea. I can see John Jarrett will be in a chair. There he is in the front row on the right-hand side as we look at it. John Jarrett, there he is. John is being wheeled by his granddaughter Alicia. John is the president of the Korea and Southeast Asia Forces Association, and he was recently made a member of the Order of Australia for his good work as well. So it's good to see our World War II veterans being recognised, not on days, just on days like this, but also on other days as well by their nation. Malaya and Borneo veterans led by President Paul Rosenweig in the blue beret. Flag bearer I can see is Major Don Cameron. And we also remember our former friend, not our former friend, our good friend and former President Brian Selby, who we lost last year. You've got the Naval Association, led by President Peter Braddock.
Also Henry Young, who will be learning much more about him later.
Henry's a Fleet Air Arm veteran. He's 99. He had the distinction of serving in the Army and the Air Force and the Navy during a career from 1943. There he is with his blue tie. He actually played in the Masters tennis at Melbourne earlier this year.
And what a champion. The fans loved him.
He told me this morning he's still playing competitively, and they've put in a new grade, over 85s, just for him. He reckons he's going to blitz it.
Has he got a competitor, though?
No, he got one from down from Goa, that's it. So, Far East Strategic Reserve, led by Maury Davey. He's the state president of the FESR Association. The State Secretary Peter Atkins is there. The men of the FESR were regular Australian Defence Force troops who provided close support for ground operations during the Malayan emergency, the Indonesian confrontation and the Vietnam War.
And today the names of Brian Pelgrave and Dennis Hoare, their names were added to the post-World War II Operations Memorial that was unveiled. We saw that earlier prior to at the dawn service.
Absolutely.
The Royal Australian Navy in Vietnam. And the destroyers.
Yes, the destroyers in Vietnam. They were attached to the 7th Fleet in Vietnam. The Hobart, the Perth, the Brisbane, the Vendetta, and they were known as gunline destroyers, delivering naval gunfire offshore to ground forces.
And that's followed by the clearance divers.
Yes, now these people were very special.
Certainly.
They were equivalent of the American SEALs, the highly trained and courageous And I want to send a cheerio to a mate of mine, Grant. He's the proud dad of Harrison now. Harrison's went to Marriottville High, and he's a current day senior clearance diver in diving team 1. Last month his job was, when he had a quiet day, was to involve the retrieval of the downed chopper in Jarvis Bay that crashed. So if you're a clearance diver, you have lots of interesting things to do.
Yeah, recovery, disposal and demolition of sea mines, clearance of obstacles, underwater battle, damage repair and clandestine placing of charges and demolitions.
Yeah.
Well, this was the dangerous role, wasn't it? Because they have to go in and make sure everything's safe for everyone to follow.
Got a couple of Land Rovers. One of them's got Warwick Raymond in it. Warwick's a Malaya veteran. And in the other Land Rover, I expect to see Jim Carney, Peter England and Bob McAvoy. Bob's a well-known veteran sporting his 110 light anti-aircraft battery air defender grey cap. Can I see that anywhere? And Bob served as a young officer in Malaya and went on to distinguish himself in Vietnam with A Battery 12 Field Regiment.
Should mention the military vehicles used in the march are provided by the Military Vehicles Preservation Society of South Australia, and they're housed at Edinburgh.
Yeah. This is the start of the Vietnam veterans, and of course we remember the 523 killed and the 2,400 wounded. 58 South Australians, and the first group is the Australian Army Training Team. South Australian members of the team included, among others, Brigadier Pat Beale, DSO MC, Tony Mogridge from Blackwood, Snowchester and Vic Pennington. Now we have the Armour Corps, and
you can see their flags are lowered there. The flags are lowered, and that's to honour 5 South Australians from 3rd Cavalry Regiment who were killed in action in South Vietnam.
We can catch the gentleman in the last rank with the tan jacket saluting. We can catch him. That's Roger Cook being pushed by his colleague Craig Mitchell. Craig was a national serviceman. That's Roger. Roger was an engineer, distinguished himself, and was a former Wallaby player. The bloke pushing him is Craig Mitchell, who was called John Wayne in Vietnam for I don't have to explain why. And he was badly wounded. His driver was killed, and one of the men in the front rank, Bob Heggie, is carrying a flag in honour of Craig's driver. So it's all a lot of loyalty and a lot of camaraderie, a lot of remembrance.
Now the Royal Australian Artillery, they supported infantry units operating out of the 1st Australian Task Force base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thi.
They did. Lieutenant Colonel John Derbyshire was leading that group. He served with 107 Battery in 70-71. Now we have the engineers.
So their roles included combat engineering, construction. Also, they were able to fight as infantry as they were needed. And behind them, we have the tunnel rats.
Absolutely. I'd like to mention Terry Zaja, who is a veteran of Malaya and Vietnam, would normally march there. He was one of the finest blokes I've ever known. We lost him in 2020. And under the tunnel rats, or behind the tunnel rat banner, I can see Tony Parmenter. Tony is one of the many Aboriginal men who volunteered to serve in Vietnam. He's a Cookata Wirangu man.
Just on those tunnel rats, 1 in 3 of those men in the tunnel rats were killed or wounded during their tour.
I just can't imagine how the courage it takes to climb into a small, black, dusty, hot tunnel, not knowing who's at the other end, and all you've got is a torch and a pistol. You know, extraordinary.
So we have the Royal Australian Corps of Signals. So their job was to maintain communications between Australia and Vietnam.
And then 161 reconnaissance flight, that's the blue banner. I think an aircraft that's going to fly over later might have been part of 161, one of those light aircraft.
And the name of Alan Jelly, who was killed in action in Vietnam, his name has been added to the memorial that was unveiled early this morning at dawn service.
In the Jeep that was just after Group 4 was Tony Mogridge, a member of the training team. There he is. Good on you, Tony. Well known in Blackwood. Big CFS man, I remember. Now we have the Royal Australian Army Service Corps, led by Major Dean Ryan and Tony French.
And they supported the units to pretty much provide everything needed to keep the soldiers in the field.
We've got 86 transport there, great unit.
Why is that a great unit, Bill? Tell us why.
Some of my men. We were actually an interstate unit, so we're not many South Australians, but they all marched. Jim McGowan's leading the push. The banner has been carried by the family of Rod Langman. Rod was one of our much-loved veterans. He passed away in 2013, but his family maintains a link with Rod's service by, I think there were 3 generations of Rod's family marching today. Cheers to Rocky Enoch, who served. He can't march today. Rocky's 94. He served in Korea and Vietnam. And we also remember Mick Hicks, Trevor Nugget Whalen, Johnny Jebb and Gary Wolford, who served with 86 and have gone in recent years. We still miss them. They're good boys and great mates.
Pipes and drums of the Royal Caledonian Society competing with Bill.
I'll give you a break for a couple of seconds. We've got one Australian Field Hospital. I think Titch Tyson, there he is, just behind, there he is, Titchy Tyson. There wouldn't be a man that does more for the ex-service community. He served with One Field Hospital in Vietnam and has not stopped looking after his veteran mates from that day in 1970. Known
as the Bat or the Vampire,
yep.
First Australian Field Hospital. Often would be calling for blood donations from those in the field. So the motto was, well, as they were described, the vampires are looking for blood.
There you go.
And had a good record though. 99% success rate for patients who reached the facility of the Australian Field Hospital.
I think Doc Beard was very proud of the fact that anybody that got to the theatre, I don't think they lost anybody.
Now we have the 2nd Australian Field Ambulance, so they provided the immediate medical treatment and assessment to any casualties who were evacuated from areas.
Here's 8 Field Ambulance.
And that replaced the 2nd Field Ambulance
yes.
Between 1967 and 72.
Right marker of 8 Field Ambulance is Rod Murray, but Brigadier Rob Atkinson's there with the blue beret. Jeff Virgo is also there. Cheers to Maury Peacock, who'll be watching from home. Both Jeff Virgo and Maury Peacock rendered great service in Vietnam, as did Rob. Rob is actually, with the blue beret, a veteran of Vietnam, Rwanda, Bougainville, Gulf War I and East Timor.
Wow. In
his spare time, he provided civil assistance at Banda Aceh and Samoa.
That's called good service, isn't it? Like, over that period of time as well.
Extraordinary.
And that was followed by RAMI, the electrical and mechanical engineers. They pretty much fixed and repaired everything from vehicles to tanks, weapons, equipment. There they are.
Yeah, that's Rod Murray with his tie on there, his medical corps tie. And there's RAMI. I think they're followed by the Vietnam Veterans Organisations. I can see Phil Scroop carrying the flag there. Phil, well-known character from Clarendon. There he is.
They've done some hard yards, the association, the Vietnam Veterans Organisations. They've done some hard yards because it wasn't initially accepted that it was a worthwhile experience.
No, initially it was pretty tough, and if it wasn't for the RSL, the Vietnam Veterans Association, Vietnam Veterans Federation, then it would be, it wouldn't be a, we wouldn't be where we are. There's Norm Goodall, the man with the shock of grey hair. Norm was awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross. He commanded 9 Squadron RAAF and he flew Bushranger gunships. Of course, when we see RAAF Vietnam, we remember Michael Herbert, who was lost for 40 years before being found. And his remains recovered 40 years after he went.
Submarines Association of Australia.
So up to the Australian entertainment groups in Vietnam. So the Forces Advisory Council on Entertainment was formed in 1966 and provided the platform for groups to travel to Vietnam for concerts for the Australian troops.
And I think many of us don't appreciate how much of a boost to morale that they gave. A short reprieve from the hardships of war and conflict.
There's Johnny Mack and Bev Harrell marching there. And Ann Wills, mention Ann Wills. Has a marvellous link, well, no, it's a very tragic link with Anzac Day. Her father, who was a serviceman, sadly went to the Cross of Sacrifice after the march, and tells me he had a heart attack from which he didn't survive. So Anzac Day is very poignant for the Wills family.
And we just saw a Cessna piloted by Darrell Hill. The reconnaissance aircraft call sign during the Vietnam War was Possum, yes, which is quite timely at the moment, isn't it?
Now we see, sure if we can get back to the Vietnamese veterans. They did a marvellous job defending their homeland, but were ultimately unsuccessful, and they've come to a new country and they've not forgotten their military service, and they march each year very proudly, remembering their loss. There's the Royal Australian Regiment Association being led by, that's Group 7, being led by Michael von Berg, MCOAM.
And it was 50 years ago that finally we saw all units of the Royal Australian Regiment stationed in Australia for the very first time.
Yeah. First Battalion's being led by Gary Pope. The 2nd Battalion by Scott Jeffrey. He served with the battalion in East Timor and the Solomon Islands. Also marching as Warrant Sir John Craig, a veteran of Afghanistan. Now we've got 3rd Battalion led by Colonel Peter Scott in the chair. He's a veteran of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, then he served in Korea and Vietnam. He's being, he commanded 3RR in Vietnam. Today, Peter is being wheeled by Michael Clothier. Now, Michael is the son of Peter's platoon sergeant when he was in Japan. Michael's father was Barney Clothier. Barney was an Aboriginal man who served in World War II in Korea. And the Clothier family have a distinguished military record, and many of them are marching there today.
And we will have more on him with a special story on him later after the march today too. You can also see there the Tiger's Head, that's the 5th Battalion, raised at Holsworthy Barracks in New South Wales. And detachments also served in Rwanda, Cambodia, Bougainville and Solomon Islands.
Led by Ron Gaskin. Brian Johnson is there as the right guide. I think he's the fellow in yellow. He was the signaller in the anti-tank platoon. He was wounded in a ground contact and then wounded again when he was being winched out on the dust-off chopper. So particularly unfortunate situation for Brian. He doesn't get mentioned often. Obviously significant service. 6th Battalion led by Bill Wallace. Banner carriers are Jim Mavramatis and Chris Exeldaris. Sorry, Chris Exeldaris. Charles was seriously wounded in a bunker contact while he was with the battalion.
The 7th Battalion, 2 tours of Vietnam. The first in 67, 68, and then in 1970-71. That's followed by 8 RAR, established in Enoggera in Queensland in 1966.
Not many in 8 today because they have a interstate reunion commitments. We've got 9 RAR. Led by Jeff Betcher. Jeff served with A Company. He's a talented ocean racer, Jeff. He won the Sydney Hobart with his Yacht Secret men's business in 2010. At the rear is Adrian Craig, who is a valuable contributor to the ex-service community in a wide variety of ways. I'm sure if Warren Featherby's there. If he's not, we're thinking about you, Warren. There he is, the very back in the straw hat, I think. I think that's Warren, not sure. Warren.
And I just want to mention, Bill, we see the medals of this stage of the march. Most medals are worn on the left. That means they are earned by that person. If they're also wearing medals on the right, that means their ancestors, their forebears served, and they are the next of kin.
That's right, that's the way to remember the contribution made by your loved one. Never let their service be forgotten. You can do that by wearing those medals to a commemorative event, but you just wear them on the right-hand side, not the left.
Moving to Group 8 now, more recent conflicts and peacekeepers.
We've got Kuwait there.
Yep.
We remember Guy Bowring, who served with the RAAF in Kuwait. He was the man that strongly defended the Repat Hospital door park, and that's borne fruit with the creation of the Veterans Health Precinct there.
1,800 ADF members from all three services were deployed to Kuwait. And that was in response to Iraq's invasion in 1990. And that's followed by Somalia.
Last Tuesday it was announced that Somalia veterans will be awarded the Meritorious Unit Citation for their service. And they served, as we know, under extremely challenging conditions. And this recognition is very well deserved.
It's followed by peacekeepers. Now, often in our minds, we perhaps think this would be a calm mission, but it's not. It's still extremely dangerous.
It's Colonel Steve Larkins, OAM, a veteran of Rwanda, who's the president of the South Australian Peacekeepers RSL sub-branch. Yes, it's definitely not for the faint-hearted.
No. And peacekeepers, they comprise of civilians as well as Army, Navy and Air Force members. And they take part in Australia's deployments overseas in support of the UN and other peacekeeping operations. So UN peacekeepers have served in 61 countries.
Amazing contribution. This is now the INDEFET. INDEFET was a United Nations mandated multinational force committed to East Timor to address the deteriorating humanitarian and security situation following the territory's vote for independence from Indonesia. And we deployed troops there between 1999 and 2000.
Well, there were 9,000 coalition troops there at the height.
And a dozen nations.
Yeah, and Australia contributed 5,000, so a massive contribution from Australia.
It's amazing when you think back, isn't it?
And now we go to Afghanistan.
Another huge contribution from Australia, with more than 20,000 Australian military personnel served in Afghanistan over a 13-year period.
And 41 Australian soldiers lost their lives. 362 were wounded.
And 4 Victoria Crosses awarded.
And now we have Iraq. So at the outbreak of war in 2003, the Army provided a 500-strong task force group, but within 3 years, that number had risen to 1,400. Now we have the Australian Rifle Company.
Australian Rifle Company of Butterworth. They're mounting a campaign at the moment to have their service recognised as active service, so we'll see how that goes. We've got...
And now we move on to Solomon Islands.
Bougainville and Solomon Islands. In Bougainville it was Belisi, which Belisi meaning peace agreement or consensus. And we go to Solomon Islands, as you say.
Well, the last Australian troops returned home to Australia from Solomon Islands 10 years ago, the 1st of August 2013. That's followed by border protection operations. Now, this was set up, the command was set up in 2005 by the Australian federal government. And members of Army Reserve units in South Australia have deployed on these operations, as have surveillance aircraft from RAAF at Edinburgh. That's followed by the International Stabilisation Force, Timor-Leste, when violence broke out in 2006 within military ranks. violence escalated and Australia deployed to help.
Police peacekeepers with their UN blue banner there. That includes civilian police from all states in Australia, including federal police. And they've had deployments to Cyprus, Kashmir, Timor-Leste, Mozambique, Cambodia, New Guinea, Haiti, Somalia and the Solomon Islands. Humanitarian and
the Defence Civilians Operational Service. So they assisted commanders in the field as operation analysts.
yeah. Now we have the national servicemen being led by Padre Rod Denton. And the association sadly recently lost its president, former distinguished SAPOL officer Barry Presgrave AM, and a great tragedy for them all. These were men that were obliged to serve and did so willingly and were ever ready. Some of them went overseas and served their nation in conflicts. Others didn't, but they were all ready to do so if required.
So there were two national service schemes. The first ran from 1951 to 1959 and then again from 1965 to 1972.
And that's followed by the Australian Defence Force Health Services, formerly known as the Australian Army Medical Services, formed more than 100 years ago. So we've got a mix of full-time and part-time personnel in this group.
Led today by Colonel Toby Thomas in uniform. Colonel Thomas was deployed to Rwanda, East Timor, Bougainville, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Just in the white trousers there, the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service. So over the course of World War II, over 3,000 women served in the RANs, but it was disbanded at the end of World War II. They continued to operate until 1985 when female personnel were integrated into the Royal Australian Navy. So HMAS Adelaide. So crews from both the HMS AS Adelaide 1 and World War II light cruiser and HMAS Adelaide 2, a guided missile frigate, commissioned in 1980 and decommissioned in 2008.
Is HMAS a counter? This was a shore base for the Adelaide Port Division of the Royal Australian Navy Reserve. HMAS Encounter was established in 1965. It was based at Birkenhead. It was recommissioned in May 22, initially at Keswick, but for eventual relocation to Osborne.
Now we have Tingara. So this includes members of the Navy who served under the name Tingara during training and also at any stage of their career. It's the Aboriginal word for open sea. Our transport vehicles again playing such an important role on this day.
Many years ago, the vehicles used to be Commonwealth cars, white Commonwealth cars, but you can understand just by looking at those vehicles what an addition they make to the march, and you can see how they give a real fillip to the veterans that are being carried in them.
We've got some of the national servicemen in that particular vehicle.
There we've got Kevin Newton, Ron Fleet, Dennis Brown and Jerry Blackshaw in those vehicles. Now we get to return and non-return former and serving personnel. Former members of the Australian Army.
And today the name of Vern Cohen, who lost his life while on service in PG 1973, was added to that memorial at the dawn service commemorations this morning.
There was the Women's Royal Australian Army Corps, and our the current president of the RSL here in South Australia, who does such a good job, Cheryl Cates, was a proud member of the Women's Royal Australian Army Corps, but now she marches up the front as a Grand Marshal.
And 10,000 women served as RAC, both full-time and part-time, for over a 33-year period.
The Officer Training Unit at Skyville. This is where young national servicemen were identified.
Well, they went to train, didn't they, to become junior officers as platoon commanders overseas. A really demanding course too, 22 weeks. And the unit had a failure rate of about 30%. So they really put them through their paces.
Not for the faint-hearted.
No.
If you're a national serviceman who was conscripted for 2 years, you do 6 years, 6 months training to become a second lieutenant. Then you might do 6 months with an infantry battalion, and then your last year would be spent on active service as a platoon commander in Vietnam. So it was a very interesting 2 years, a very hectic 2 years.
So we have the South Australian Mounted Rifles coming up now. And the unit traces its heritage to the cavalry troop of the South Australian Volunteer Forces, formed in 1840. And since 1948, it's been an Army Reserve unit.
See the air defence artillery there? Provided protection to military assets from army units in the field, to a defensive role to the Royal Australian Navy, and air defence to the Royal Australian Air Force.
16 Regiment of the Royal Australian Artillery is based at Woodside, and they deploy surface-to-air missiles. Royal Australian Engineers being led by Ken Daly. The main role of the engineers is to provide mobility and counter mobility capabilities in the Australian Army, to the Australian Army and its allies. And here in South Australia, the engineers are represented by 3 Field Squadron, which is based at Warradale. Sapper Darren Smith, who we're honouring today with his name being added to the post-World War II Operations Memorial, was a former member of 3 Field Squadron. A plaque was erected to him at Warradale in 2019 and unveiled by his mother.
Once a sapper, always a sapper.
Yeah.
So the Survey Corps there, members providing survey data for the compilation and production of topographical military maps, which are still used today in a civilian role. I think it's slightly different, though, in terms of how they access those maps compared to past days.
Survey Corps, yes, it's... they're not quite as essential in that service. You're right, Neil. It's all done by GPS these days rather than the more laborious ways they did it in years gone by.
We also have to give a big shout out to all our marching bands who are taking part today, playing a really important role in between each group, each section, helping everyone maintain the correct pace for the march.
The Royal South Australia Regiment.
Just behind the Corps of Signals. Yep.
The RSA, our association, represents members from National Service, CMF, Reserves and Regular Army who've served with 1027 Battalion, which is the amalgamation of South Australia's, 2 of South Australia's most prominent units, the 10th Battalion and the 27th Battalion, both of whom served at Gallipoli.
Yeah, the Royal South Australian Regiment's the heir and custodian of battle honours awarded to those raised in South Australia, and include those earned in the Boer, the Great War and the Second World War.
Yes. Royal Australian Corps of Transport, and I'd like to acknowledge Warrant Officer Class 1 Linda Moll, who passed very recently, only a week or two ago. She was just a talented, respected and professional soldier who gave her absolute loyalty to her corps and the army and the nation, and we send our deepest condolences to her husband Alex and family. I can see Blue Wanacott there, and Rob Kenny and Beryl Rowe all looking very smart. And we go on to Ordnance Corps. This group consists of both reservists and regular army members. They trained as clerks. They were supply operators, petroleum operators, parachute riggers and ammunition technicians.
Now we have the electrical mechanical engineers. So they were in charge of maintaining and recovering all Army electrical and mechanical equipment.
And the Royal Australian Army Catering Corps. An army marches on its stomach. They're very essential.
As essential as the Royal Australian Army Pay Corps.
Absolutely. By the look of the numbers, the Pay Corps are more essential. Well, we still have a Pay Corps. I think Catering Corps now has been largely put out to contract, but there's a Pay Corps there for sure.
Now the Royal Australian Corps of Military Police. So they looked after security duties, prisoner of war handling, investigations of any offences, also to maintain discipline and the running of military prisons.
Got the Royal Australian Air Force former members, all former members of the Air Force not marching in other units. 75 years since the Berlin Airlift Squadron formed at the RAAF Richmond in August 1948.
And we also saw the City of Adelaide Squadron, the 24th City of Adelaide Squadron, RAAF.
This is the one that was formed in 1940, reformed in 51 as Ballala as a citizen Air Force Fighter Squadron. And here's the Australian Defence Force. These are the regular army troops that serve our nation, being led by the Royal Australian Navy. And we'll have HMAS Encounter.
And this is where we see the numbers of our personnel marching. And we can only imagine that that's what numbers would have been like for our earlier groups.
Leading the Navy Guard there with carrying the sword is the commanding officer of HMAS Encounter, Commander Emma MacDonald Kerr, who enjoys her command and plays a great deal of an emphasis on getting to know all his sailors and doing the right thing by them. And we have 9 Brigade. 9 Brigade is headquarters is based at Keswick Barracks, and the brigade is commanded by Brigadier Graham Goodwin, who is indeed a Grand Marshal today, but leading the brigade in formation's Deputy Commander Colonel Tim Orders, along with the Brigade RSM Warrant Officer Class 1 Stephen Taylor.
Behind them, the 1st Armoured Regiment. It's the senior regiment of the Royal Australian Armoured Corps. Originally formed July 1949. And the regiment served as a part of the occupation force in Japan.
And all these people we're seeing now are the young men and women who would be ready to go off at a moment's notice to defend our nation. So as you go through the march, you see, you know, the men and women you saw in the very early sections of the march were like this, you know, 60, 70 years ago, 80 years ago. It's a progression. You know, it's all about being prepared to serve your nation if it ever needs you. You start off as young men and women, teenagers, and I guess the importance of what you've done and your experiences never leave you, and nor should they be ever forgotten.
And there was a period that is talked about where Australia didn't have commitments overseas and some didn't get to serve their country overseas. But Bill, as you've told us a few times, there's a form that you sign that basically says you will give everything up to and including your life.
Yes, and it's unfair, you know, because the service of people who don't go overseas is just as valuable as those that did. And as I've often pointed out, you know, whether you go overseas or not is just the vagary of the posting order, you know, and the circumstance at the time. More recently, conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, but there was, as you say, Neil, what we know in the services as being the Great Peace, and no one went overseas. But all service is equal. Here's 7 RAR.
And 7 RAR was formed in September 1965 as part of Australia's commitment to the Vietnam War. They're currently based at Edinburgh, that began in 2011, and that's where they remain today.
And served in all conflicts since Vietnam, including East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, and more recently supporting the nation with domestic operations.
And today it's proudly parading its Queen and regimental colours, including the battle honours for Vietnam 65 to 72 and Iraq 2003 to 2011. And the 7 RAR is since October last year came under the command of 9 Brigade. So it's a truly South Australian unit.
We just see those numbers stretch out now, and I can vaguely understand what it was like in the 50s. And
yes,
these sort of marches, who all of them, veterans and those serving, would have seen action at that time.
Absolutely. And it would have even been more impressive because they were all marching 6 or 8 abreast. They weren't marching in threes like we are here, so the impression of them coming down the road would have been more significant. And there were, you know, many thousands of marches.
So as we honour those who are marching today, the commanding officer of 1027 Battalion is also carrying the sword of the late Captain Paul Mackay, a former battalion officer. We're honouring him today. His name was added to the post-World War II operations memorial that we saw earlier this morning.
In 1945, there were 10,000 marches, and I think a crowd of about 50,000 or so viewed the march.
Might not have as many as that today, but we've certainly come a long way, say, from the early 70s, and the way in which Anzac Day has become an important national moment.
It's a very important, as we say, it's the single most important non-religious day of commemoration, and Australians take it very, very seriously indeed.
And just on our current deployments overseas, we have a number of people in the Middle East, Sudan, Egypt. We have many training troops to defend their homeland of Ukraine. So we have Australian troops in the UK as part of Operation Kudu.
That was 1027 Battalion that's just gone past. Commanding Officer Sam Benavisti. Now we've got 9 Combat Service Support Battalion, which was raised in 1995 as a part of the 9th Brigade. And its role is to provide combat service support to the brigade, including recovery and repair, supply, health and transport. Leading today is Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Weldon, and the RSM is Warrant Officer Class 1 Stuart Johnson.
And now we have RAAF Edinburgh. It's not only hosting Army units from the 9th Brigade, Edinburgh is home to many RAAF units. Main tenant is 92 wing. Will we talk about what an important day this is for the public to come and to honour those who have served and who are still serving. But we're also seeing some people take part in this for the very first time, still.
Absolutely, it's surprising, and there are people. I've got a dear friend in the hills, Colin Wagoner, who is 104 years and 5 months. He's never marched, and I would love to get him to march, but he just doesn't feel comfortable about doing it, and we respect that. It's a very personal thing. Some people love it and will do it every year, and others don't find it something they prefer to avoid, and they just sit back and perhaps I think the remembrance is still there. They just choose to do it a different way. Colin is quite a marvellous man who saw service in Morotai, North Borneo, and at 105 years and some 4 months he was still driving until recently. This is I think 24 Squadron, City of Adelaide Squadron. Contingent commander was Group Captain Greg Bird, who's the Chief of Staff of our Air Warfare Centre. Then we've got the 3 flights, the first one being led by Wing Commander Alison Tinkler, and the other number 2 and number 3 flights you can see here, RAF Edinburgh flights. Now we're on to the representative of Allied Nations.
Just quickly on the service of our current personnel, not only are they involved in operations overseas, but as we've briefly mentioned, so many operations at home as well, particularly in times of emergencies, floods, bushfires. They're there to help. When COVID-19 first hit, the pandemic, they were on the ground. We rely on them for so many things.
And that in itself is testing, Emma, because I've spoken to some Army commanding officers who I know well, and they say, look, we love doing that sort of work. It's important, and we do it for the nation, but we have a job to do, and that's to train for war. And it's very hard to be doing both. There's only 24 hours in the day. But they do it gracefully, and we, of course, enjoy the benefit and the safety they deliver us. But they have a real preparation for war is what they're being ready to go is what they're all about.
Bill, you see a couple of those signs that are going through, not the Royal Marines, there's obviously marchers behind them, but some of those signs that there's nobody marching under that sign. What happens? What's the process there?
Well, that's giving everybody, what we say is that anybody who has a military service or even a link with the military, there will be a place for them to march. So there is that opportunity. But each year, if people don't march for a period of time, there are no marches, that sign will be retired. So what's happening today is they clearly thought, we anticipated marchers would come out today to march behind those signs, and people have the opportunity, but in not all, no one knows who's going to turn up on Anzac Day. Neil, it's perhaps the biggest parade of the year, and it would be the only military parade where we have no idea who's going to be there. So it's a very best estimate made by a very hard-working and diligent Anzac Day committee. Everybody has an opportunity to come and remember the service of a loved one or their own service if they want.
As we continue with our allies, we can see the Royal Air Force and followed by the boy entrance. So these men were inducted into the trade training between the ages of 15 and 17. It's followed by Canada and France.
Greece.
Yep, the very distinctive Greece, and the association founded in Adelaide by Greek migrants. Greece was occupied by Axis forces from 1941 to 1945. And and some members also served in the Korean War from 1950 to 53.
We also remember our allies in Malta, the Netherlands, Poland, and also the United States of America. Americans have fought alongside Australian forces in every major conflict since World War I.
So you can see the flags draped on some of these transport vehicles. They get the Greeks, and then the Americans are behind as well.
I'd like to acknowledge Brian Ellis. I was expecting to see Brian earlier on in the march with HMA Fairmiles, a Navy ship. And I'm not sure whether he was there. We certainly hoped he was going to come along, but we give him a shout out. Brian enlisted in April 43, age 17, which makes him 98. And he worked on HMAS Kapunda as a stoker mechanic, but he went to the Fairmiles in 45 and stayed with her to the end of the war. So cheerio to you, Brian.
Also, well, we got this opportunity to thank the Australian Navy, Australian Air League and Australian Air Force cadets, who along with guides and scouts, they're the ones carrying the unit identification signs along the course of the march.
Yes.
And now we move on to the descendants. So this will be a replica of what we saw earlier, but this time it is the descendants of those who have served, and they'll be wearing their medals on their right.
And this is a classic piece of organisation by the RSL and SA in particular, where everybody's got a place in the march, including the descendants, but the RSL prefers in South Australia not to have the descendants marching with the original units.
Yes.
And those actual men who served.
You're right, Neil, and that position, which was a very strong one, taken some years ago, and people argued that it wasn't fair, but every other state now looks at South Australia as being the state of the art, because what we've got in the other states now is very large units, but there might be 50, 60 people in a unit, but 48, 58 of them will be family members, and there'll only be 1 or 2 veterans. And for those that are viewing the march, it's absolutely impossible to see who the veteran is. It's a real case, I've used the term before, of where's Wally. So the other states, particularly Western Australia most recently, have looked to South Australia and said, can we copy your model to give everybody a position, but everyone can be acknowledged in an appropriate way. And of course the focus is very much on the ones who may not be here next year, the World War II veterans. So you saw earlier on the 1 or 2 World War II veterans in behind a unit sign. You can imagine how difficult it would be if they were surrounded by 20 to 30 people who are next of kin. No disrespect intended, but it's about just understanding and paying the respect in the best possible way.
And of course, you'll notice a difference, Emma, that you mentioned before about all of these as descendants. Medals are on the right side.
Yes.
And it was really lovely before seeing photos being carried by children of their ancestors who served. I think a really important way of making sure the next generation understands the sacrifice that these men and women gave.
Absolutely. And being able to do it more precisely makes it easier, so someone can carry the photograph of a loved one like that woman is, and know that people understand precisely why she's there and can join her in remembering her loved one.
And Bill, you said others have looked at South Australia and the way the march is set out, WA in particular, but is there a move for places like Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne to do the same with the RSL and the march there?
No, well, they all have their own individual managements, their own individual boards, and they, in a sense, they do their own thing. South Australia is the only state where the all of these remembrance ceremonies, even down to suburban level, are coordinated by the RSL. In other states, particularly when it comes to this type of march, they're coordinated by a committee which involves councils and all sorts of other people who don't necessarily have the military experience. But in South Australia, the leadership here has ensured that this particular march and the Anzac Eve Youth Vigil last night, the dawn service this morning, is run by the RSL, and it's run by one committee, the Anzac Day Committee, and that at the moment is commanded by Ian Smith, or chaired by Ian Smith, I should say, and that ownership is really held on to, and we're very proud of that. I think veterans are in the best place to understand how best to commemorate other veterans and know all the detail of how to present it to the public. So essentially the Anzac Day March is the RSL's gift to the state of South Australia.
You don't think Ian Smith commands?
Hey?
You don't think Ian Smith commands? You think he's...
I think he does. Gently. He's a former federal policeman, so, as well as a military policeman.
Right.
So what chance have you got?
Yeah, gentle but firm.
I think what's really poignant today is that we're seeing so many photos of these soldiers, and you just realise how young they were when they served.
The other thing is, it's just good to have, there's a lot more descendants this year.
Yeah,
like we've
agreed.
moved through that period of COVID, which obviously in for 1 year we didn't even have a march, but yeah, we've moved on from that now, and it's just great to see so many people out.
You're watching Anzac Day commemorations in Adelaide, live and exclusive on ABC TV, iView and Facebook.
Yeah.
In our commentary team, my colleague Neil Cross, RSL SA Ambassador Bill Denny, and I'm Emma Rivelato.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure if we can pick up the Z Special Unit banner. And we remember those great soldiers, Jack Treadray, Murph Fox and Jack Felsted, who were regular marchers with Z Special Unit. Jack resplendent in his red beret. Sadly, they've all gone now, and that explains the banner today is being carried by, or demonstrates Jack's special link with the Broadview Football Club, and each year they present a Jack Treadray MM medal to the best player in the Anzac round match. So the link with that club is alive and well, and they'll continue to carry that banner. Today it's being carried by the men and women's A grade captains Jay O'Leary and Hannah DeVito, and representing Jack Felsted are his sons Chris and Tony. The point being that that unit will be at the front of the march until all the veterans of that unit pass away, and then there's a year grace given to see if anybody else who hasn't marched before comes out. If they don't, the unit is retired down to the latter part of the march, where descendants can march behind. The banners can still be carried, and descendants can march behind the banner and still remember their loved ones, but not in the position of that the servicemen would take were they to survive. So you get more or less a duplicate march. You get the march up the front with the veterans, and then there can be a secondary opportunity, smaller, if descendants want to be involved.
I remember seeing the cartoons that explained why the veterans want to march by themselves.
Yes, that one.
And it was like the veteran marching, but he wasn't alone because the ghosts of his mates were around him.
Yes, I remember that. Had a huge impact, that particular cartoon. We carried it around and showed people from time to time if they lost sight of what was the meaning of the day was, or what the importance of the day.
And of course, this march is part of the trilogy of commemorations of Anzac Day. So we have the dawn service, which is indicative of the funeral service. That's followed by the march, which symbolises the march to the gravesite, and the cross of sacrifice, which will follow this. That is symbolising the burial.
So every person marching here will be remembering somebody dear to them, somebody who served and who's no longer with us. So they know that, what did they say, that you never die until you die twice, once when you pass away and a second time when people stop speaking your name. And there'll be a lot of names spoken today which will keep people alive, or their memories alive.
And this is such an important way of ensuring that their memories live on in their families, but also for the wider community, for the public as well, for South Australia to remember.
What's going to happen very soon too for the relatives of those who fought in the Second World War? The numbers are dwindling of the actual veterans, and this part of the march will become even more important when the last of those veterans is gone, and we seek to remember the Anzac spirit, but also just why we don't want to see another war like World War I or World War II.
Exactly, Neil. That's exactly right. Remembrance is a very it's such a it's a way of looking at things which is does mean that you understand that war is something you want to avoid at all costs. But on the other hand, if people do go to war and do serve their nation, then they deserve to be remembered. So it's complicated. It's complicated.
We have mentioned it earlier in the march, but we really do need to mention it again, that we have to thank the Australian Navy, the Australian Air League and Australian Air Force cadets, along with guides and scouts, and they've been carrying all those unit identification signs right along the course of this march.
The descendants of South Vietnam, as we know. People in South Vietnam fled their country.
That's right. Yes, the war for South Vietnam, it concluded for the Australian forces formally in, I think, January or February of 1973, when the Governor-General proclaimed the end of the war. But the South Vietnamese fought on for another couple of years without Australian and American support. They eventually were defeated. And the war for them concluded in Black April, which was the 30th of April 1975, and many of them then chose to get onto leaky boats and come to Australia and other places, and we took 100,000 refugees, and they've made a marvellous contribution to the country.
We can now see our Navy cadets. They include young men and women aged between 13 and 19. And they learn skills associated with citizenship, leadership and seamanship. We actually have also Army units, 23 Army cadet units in South Australia and Broken Hill with 600 members.
Just back to what we said at the start of this morning as well, is that it's 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War. Does that make
Amazing.
Does that make you feel?
It does make me feel old, particularly when you feel as though you can remember the things you were doing in those last days. But yeah, 50 years. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, so 70 years since the armistice that ended the fighting in Korea.
There's Tony Chaplin, the Chief Marshal. Tony's been doing that job for many years, and he's responsible for all the coordination and all the various timings and organisation that's involved in getting a march like this going. And there are the people following him are his marshals. There's several hundred of them, all in all. I think there's over, when you add in the number of people that are carrying signs and marshalling and behind the scenes, it's over 1,000 people getting this to ensure that this parade goes well. And they take great pride in it. They're very proud of it. They meet on the first Tuesday of every month to try and make every year better. And I know at the end of each march they ask themselves, have they enhanced or at least kept the integrity of the Anzac legacy alive? And I think they have.
So this is the last rites, if you like, of the of the march, and we've got the Barossa Light Horse Historical Association. Now, the feature in here is the riderless horse, also known as the lone charger, to signify a warrior has fallen in battle. So it's a symbol of respect and mourning.
And you can see the pair of boots, they were set backwards in the stirrups there.
So,
well, the march has now come to an end here in Adelaide. Very soon, we'll be taking you to the Cross of Sacrifice for the third part of our trilogy of Anzac Day commemorations. Before that, 94-year-old Colonel Peter Scott served for 37 years. He marched today with 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment.
This year is particularly rewarding to me because I'm marching in a wheelchair, being pushed by one of the sons of my sergeant in Japan. I was in the occupation force for 18 months, and my sergeant there was a fellow by the name of Barney Clothier. And when he married, he had 8 sons and 6 girls. And I've met a couple of the sons previously, but this time they're having a reunion, and 5 of them are going to be marching with my battalion, which is the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. And that is going to give me a big thrill, because they want to march and I want to march with them, and it gives me a connection back, to 1949, which is over 70 years ago. So it's a connection with, that's their father who served with me and probably taught me a lot of things in Japan, because I was a brand new subaltern then, and he was very, very good sergeant.
Peter Scott knew my father very well. He had very high regard for my father, and we actually met him about 5 or 6 years ago when my 3 brothers come over to march at Anzac, and we met Colonel Scott, and as soon as he heard the surname, he said, "You're not Barney's boys, are you?" And we said yes, and that's how it all started.
Albert Barney Clothier, born in 1921, was part of the stolen generation. He enlisted in 1942 in the 67 Australian Infantry Battalion and served for 6 years. He then went on to serve in Korea.
He joined when he was 18. He was just at the tail end of the Second World War. Went to Korea. He got promoted to sergeant, and then Lieutenant Colonel Scott, Lieutenant Scott, as he was in those days, was his first posting, and Dad was his platoon sergeant. My dad finished his army service as a warrant officer class 1. He was the RSM of Keswick Barracks.
In comparison, the homecoming reception for each war was very different.
It was different than Vietnam. When they come back from Korea, people loved, they paraded the streets and, and wished them all good luck.
When I look back on it, I look back upon it as with 37 years of very, very successful and rewarding experience. It was varied in what you've said, and as far as I'm concerned, what I did, I think, was a contribution to the Australian Army.
The Anzac Centenary Pathway of Honour here in Adelaide commemorates the men and women who've served Australia. In August last year, a new paver dedicated to conflicts in Thailand was added to the memorial.
Keith Fowler, or Chook as he is known, served in the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion in World War II. Keith is the last living member of his battalion of 800 men. He was a guest of honour at the dedication.
People know about Thailand. They know we had the POWs in Thailand. So it will represent those that gave their lives for the country under extreme conditions and it will be there for posterity.
Keith was captured in Java and was a Japanese prisoner of war on the Thai-Burma Railway for 3.5 years.
Keith served as a tap and hammer man on the railway, working long, gruelling hours, barefoot and on starvation rations. On one occasion, he badly scalded his legs while carrying a bucket of boiling hot black tea, and he also contracted malaria. And when he had malaria, his temperature reached 41.8 degrees Celsius. Each time, he was treated in a railway camp by fellow prisoner of war and army surgeon Weary Dunlop.
It's so hard to put into words the real feelings, how you feel about it, because so many memories keep flooding back all of a sudden. That's memories you've sort of, you've gone on to other things, and other memories have taken their places and that, but it's things like this that brings it all back again, and you realise just how fortunate we are and the life that we have now, and what the people that sacrificed have given us that life. And it's my duty, no matter how I feel, it's my duty to present myself as best I can to represent those people and those members of the forces and civilians who have died in the act of saving their country. So my job is only just a small job compared to what they have done, and it's a wonderful privilege to be able to do this.
Announced in the Australia Day Honours List this year, Keith was awarded the Medal in the Order of Australia for over 30 years' service at Veterans Affairs, helping ex-servicemen and women and their families.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
In his 100th year, Henry Young is enjoying life. He's an avid tennis player, and early this year he played at the Australian Open in a charity match. Henry's naval career began in New Zealand. He went on to train in the United Kingdom and US before coming home to Australia to join the Royal Australian Navy Fleet Air Arm.
The three ways of doing anything: the right way, the wrong way, and the Navy way. And the Navy puts you into a college to teach you to be a seaman. You're a seaman first and an airman second. And so I did 3 months in Portsmouth, learning to be a seaman. And then they had a special scheme that they thought it would be a good idea, because the Pacific War was raging at that time. If we got some of our young bloods to train in America, then when the two fleets get together, they'd speak the same language. We didn't do our deck landing training because the Navy signal for the deck landing control officers, the batsmen, in the United States Navy, they've got a signal that says go lower, and in the Royal Navy, the same signal is you are too low. So they didn't teach us deck landing training. We had to go back to United Kingdom for that. I did my initial deck landings on the Illustrious, a big fleet carrier. In the Irish Sea, it was a terrible day, actually. They postponed it twice. We lost one over the side and one jumped over the barriers. Because in those days, you only had the back half of the ship to land on. And so the only way you could guarantee getting them down was to be just above the stall, and so that still if you pulled your throttle off, you stalled and dropped like a stone. Once you did that final turn, you lost sight of the carrier, and all you could see was the batsman standing on a little outrigger or out to the side with a net underneath him so that he could jump into it in an emergency. And he would tell you when to cut your throttle. With me, I'm flying and I got the cut and boom, there I am on the deck. And it's virtually unbelievable because it's you're miles out to sea and the examiner said, and I've got it in my logbook, flew well under trying conditions. And so I'm in the Navy and I'm a pilot.
During World War II, the United Kingdom entered into a Lend-Lease agreement with the United States.
England, the United Kingdom, had no money, and the United States wanted England to win the war, so that when they ran out of money, they actually said, we will lend you the money to buy the aircraft on the condition that when the war is ended, that you return them to us or destroy them. We don't want them on the market. And England, of course, said yes, we were very happy with that. So on the way home, I was on the aircraft carrier Illustrious. We called into Colombo, and they loaded 2 squadrons of planes on the Corsairs on the ship. And when we got out to sea, one by one, we pushed them over the round down into the sea. You know, they were destroyed. Before I pushed one of them across off the thing, I got busy with a screwdriver and took out the altimeter, and that's my, on my office desk still.
On a training exercise in Northern Ireland in 1948, Henry had a lucky escape in a Sea Fury when the engine failed.
And the Sea Fury is the replacement for the Spitfire, and a wonderful plane. Wonderful Navy plane, because big and heavy and strong. They had defective fuel gauges, and they authorised us to fly with them with the defective gauges as long as we had within a certain period time. This is in Northern Ireland, and I'm suddenly fresh out of engine, and it was a day with low overcast, and I'm down low, and it was too low to bail out, and so I looked for the best field to land in. And that part of Northern Ireland, they're all fences all of stone. And there was just one paddock that I thought would be long enough for me to land in, but it just had 2 clumps of trees at the end, and I worked out that I'd be able to just squeeze in between the 2, and I almost did, except my wing clipped on this as I'm gliding down, wing clipped on one side, which tipped me over. That's when I lost my starboard wing, and then I cartwheeled across, and that's when I lost my port wing. And then I did a half loop and landed on my tail, and I'm sitting in the cockpit about 6 inches off the ground, upside down. And I can't remember getting out, but I must have got out, and then a vet from the next paddock who had been drenching cattle heard it all happen, and they got me out and took me to a little cottage.
In 1949, Henry joined the aircraft carrier HMAS Sydney. The Royal Australian Navy was forming a Navy Fleet air arm, and Henry Young was one of the first groups of pilots recruited.
When I joined the Australian Navy, I was fully trained, and Sydney was our ship. We actually went to England to pick up the ship and brought it out, laden with planes, and then when we weren't on the ship, we were at Noah. I loved my time in the Navy, and I loved my flying, and the deck landing, I got to love those too. But you're young, you know, and it's exciting, and it's a thrill. It's a thrill.
An incredible story there. Henry Young, who found a legion of new fans playing at the Australian Open early this year, playing against a 98-year-old Ukrainian man.
Sign of the times, Em.
So we've had, well, quite the couple of weeks with Anzac commemorations, and we're still working to identify, to remember those who have died. And incredibly, just a few days ago, last week, the ship at the centre of the worst maritime disaster in Australia's history was discovered, more than 4,000 metres beneath the sea. That was the Montevideo Maru shipwreck. More than 1,000 prisoners were lost, 979 Australian troops and civilians and for the families of those who were on that shipwreck. It was an incredible discovery, a time for them to reflect and honour those who died, those who were forgotten. So we remember them today, as we remember all those who have served and are currently serving. Shortly we will be taking you to the Cross of Sacrifice with the Governor's arrival. Bill, we saw with today's dawn service, we had another memorial. More names were added to the post-World War II Operations Memorial, 25 more names of those who had connections to South Australia and Broken Hill. Such an important thing to continue to recognise those who lost their lives as a result of their service.
Yes, indeed, Emma. And those people had served in conflicts from World War II right through to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they'd all been recognised in the National War Memorial in some way, but they weren't on the State Memorial. And this was an important part of the process of healing and closure for the families for a whole host of reasons and different reasons. But I think I saw the families that were there. There was a large number of family members there, and you could see clearly that they were grateful for the fact that their state had not forgotten the sacrifice they'd made through the loss of their loved one. And it's just the right thing to do. You know, it's all very well to be commemorated in Canberra and on a website somewhere, but nothing takes the place of commemorating a loved one in his home or her hometown.
And I have those names here. So we honour today James Halen, William David, John Tassell, Brian Pelgrave, Dennis Hoare, David Waldock, Alan Jelly, Brenton Mowbray, Mark McGrath, Paul McKay, Douglas Barker, Glenn Chaplin, Kevin Lynch, Dennis McCormack, Thomas Dale, Jeffrey Durow, Andrew Russell, Jamie Larkham, Darren Smith, Scott Smith, Terry Bryant, Matthew Davey, Wendy James, Vern Cohen and Kevin Shoppy.
It's interesting, they've all got their own individual story, and you know, many people listening would have links with those men and women, and I remember two of them came from the same school, Sacred Heart College. Kevin Shoppy died in 1973 or 4 in New Guinea. In New Guinea, doing survey work on Mount Wilhelm. I happened to be up there at the time, and he'd been a school friend. And Mark McGrath, similar, died in Thailand when his jet fighter crashed when he came back from doing an escort mission over Vietnam. So, and experiences of many people listening, they would know a lot of those people. Jeff Giroux, on the other hand, was an Aboriginal veteran, little known. He was shot killed in a contact in his second tour in Vietnam. But they all have a story. There's 25 stories, and now they've been taken into the rich history of the state, taken to the state's heart. And when you go to our commemorative heart, which is the State National War Memorial on North Terrace, their names will be on a tablet. It's small measure for the loss of a person, but it's nevertheless very important.
So we are waiting the arrival of the Governor, Frances Adamson, and her husband, Mr. Rod Bunton, for the Cross of Sacrifice service, which is the final part of this trilogy of Anzac commemorations here in South Australia. We started with the dawn service this morning, some moving tributes in the dawn service, followed by the march along North Terrace and King William Road. And now the third part of the trilogy, to symbolise the burial of the war dead, we have the service at the Cross of Sacrifice.
So the Governor, as you see there, about to arrive to take her place for the ceremony to begin.
Being escorted by the President of the RSL, And it's, I know I mentioned it before, but the governor's really thrown a whole new dimension on her office in the sense of the things she's done since she's arrived, and a whole range of areas to do with the Aboriginal people putting new flags at the front of Government House, and some other really interesting innovations, including throwing the lawns of Government House open for people to come in once a month to lunch on the lawns. But she's made it very clear that one priority is veterans, and she's become a good friend of Chook Fowler, and he are very in great admiration of her. And I think Chook today, as he came down King William Street, I think he was in a chair, stopped and got out of his wheelchair and marched formally past the saluting day so he could express his admiration and respect for her and the support she's given him in his latter years.
And the Cross of Sacrifice Memorial is dedicated to the memory of all those who paid the ultimate sacrifice in time of war.
Of Her Excellency, the Honourable
We take you there
Frances
now
Adamson,
for the Cross
AC
of
Governor
Sacrifice
of
service.
South Australia, and Mr Bunton, along with the RSL State President, Mrs Cheryl Cates. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the mounting of the catafalque party. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. This service of remembrance conducted following our Anzac Day March is unique to this state. Officially opened in 1922, these gardens were developed and funded by women for women, especially for widows seeking to remember and honour the sacrifice of their men who died in the Great War. known as the Garden of Memory, with the cross of sacrifice at one end and the stone of remembrance at the other. These gardens have now become a place of peace and reflection for all generations, as we remember all men and women, young and old, who have served this nation with distinction and sacrifice. Not only do we gather in the shadow of St. Peter's Cathedral, but more significantly in the shadow of our recent Easter celebrations, where we remembered the greatest sacrifice the world has known, the crucifixion and death of Jesus. Indeed, it is by that sacrifice we have come to understand all sacrifice. Hence, the memorial we gather around this morning is a cross. And these very gardens are in the shape of a cross. And if you look from above, a mirror image of the cathedral itself, also in the shape of a cross. The hymn O Valiant Hearts, written by Sir John Stanhope, are the sacrifice of Jesus and those in war. And it offers a theme of hope, that those who have given of themselves freely in sacrifice like Christ will also share with him that same hope of resurrection to new life. Let us stand and sing together, O Valiant Hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We pause now for our prayer of remembrance. We remember those members of Australian military forces who made the supreme sacrifice in times of war. We thank you for their courage, skill, dedication, and willingness to serve. We pray that the offering of their lives not be in vain, as your grace enables us to honour their legacy and dedicate our lives to the same cause of justice, freedom, and peace. We remember this day too the widows and other loved ones who have been grieved through war. Comfort them with your presence and through family and friendships. We pray for our veterans. We thank you for their service in defence of our nation and to defend the lives, well-being and freedom of others. Strengthen and encourage them and help those who continue to suffer the effects of war to know healing and recovery. We remember those who currently serve our nation, including those deployed on operations. We ask for safety amidst chaos, wisdom in decision-making, refreshment for the fatigued, and peace over anxiety. The hymn Eternal Father Strong to Save, written by William Whiting in 1860, is inspired by Psalm 107 and the story of Jesus calming the stormy seas. It's a mainstay in navies for generations. It inspires hope and faith amidst the darkness and chaos of stormy seas, and reminds us today that no matter how dark and chaotic life is and the circumstances that we may face, Christ still has authority and power and meets us there in the midst of it all. Let us stand together and sing Eternal Father, Strong to Save. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. In a moment, we will have the laying of 3 wreaths, followed by the ode, last post, a minute's silence and rouse. a brief word of explanation. A memorial such as this represents our fallen. Memorials are made to symbolise before us those who may be lost or buried elsewhere. This symbolises them being before us today. Wreaths have been used since ancient times to honour courage and bravery, as well as for mourning. In ancient times, a deceased body awaiting burial might be laid on a large stone, a catafalque, and guarded by soldiers. This is why we have a catafalque party bearing arms around our memorial, respectfully guarding and protecting the fallen. If you were to stay in barracks, you'd be woken each morning by the trumpet playing of rouse and sent to sleep at night with the last post. Here they are reversed, deliberately. The last post played first signifies that our fallen have now gone to sleep in death, and our minute silence is to let them do so, to not awaken them. The flag is at half-mast, symbolising our grief and sadness, and the bells of the cathedral have been hushed. But the silence is then broken by the rouse, the call to wake up. This expresses the Easter hope we have that death is not the end of the story. Instead, we look forward to resurrection and new life again. And so the flag returns to full mast, declaring that death is defeated and that our hope for new life wins the day. And so at the conclusion of our service, the bells will again ring. I now invite Her Excellency to lay a wreath. On behalf of Legacy Youth, Lachlan and Harper. And our representative from the Australian War Widows. We come to the reciting of the Ode of Remembrance from Lawrence Binyon's poem, For the Fallen. It will be recited for us by Mrs. Jill Davidson, herself a war widow. Following this will be the playing of the last post, minute silence and rouse. Please stand.
Catapult party, a turn, shunt.
Bang, turn, shunt.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
Catapult party, general salute, present, up. people.
We have gathered in remembrance of the men and women who have served this nation with distinction, many at the cost of their lives. All have set an example for us to follow. And in this special garden, we have remembered too the widows and families who have grieved the loss of husbands and fathers, sons and uncles, and indeed all who have suffered loss. And now may you know the encouragement and comfort of God's presence on this day of remembrance. And may Almighty God bless and enable you to live justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly, to serve Him, one another, and His creation. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain upstanding for the playing of the national anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain upstanding for the dismounting of the catafalque party.
Catapult party, M Woods, turn. Catapult party, quick.
And that brings an end to our
Ladies and gentlemen,
look
that
at the
concludes
service
our
from the Cross of
service.
Sacrifice. And of course, before that, we had the march. And this morning, it all started at the National War Memorial on North Terrace with the dawn service. Bill Denny, it's a very full day already. What have you got planned after this?
I think it will follow the concept that was laid down by our forefathers in the morning for remembrance, and from midday on, the military term go on, and people will turn to sport and getting together with their mates and having a meal and then maybe a beer or two.
And Emma, we just look forward to what comes this afternoon from Villa Breton-Neur and from Gallipoli.
Yes, we will be taking people live to Gallipoli at midday, so we look forward to those commemorations as we always do, and then to Villa Breton-Neur. Ceremonies, of course, have been held in South Australia right throughout the state, but also in particular in the state's southeast, recognising Indigenous soldiers buried in unmarked graves. The dedication ceremonies are part of a nationwide program run by volunteers to identify the graves of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women. This story is from Sam Bradbrook in Mount Gambier.
Nestled next to Mount Gambier's famous Blue Lake is the final resting place for two First World War veterans buried in unmarked graves.
There wasn't a lot of acknowledgement of service. There wasn't enough, if you like, recognition.
The families of half-brothers John Brett and John Westbury gathered for a dedication ceremony, recognising the men and their service.
More so than ever, Aboriginal people who died were rarely acknowledged with a headstone. Like, they were poverty-stricken, there was racism, they were kicked out of town.
John Westbury died in 1925 when he was just 27. John Brett lived until he was 70.
They must have been good at something. They got stabbed, they got bayoneted, they got shot, they lost toes, but they came home.
A group of volunteers is working to find more unmarked graves of Indigenous servicemen and women. 11 Aboriginal veterans have received grave dedications so far, with more to come. Advocates hope it'll lead to greater recognition of the sacrifices made by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women.
When I came to this organisation, it was overwhelming. I just couldn't believe the scale of it.
Lasting recognition for those who served their nation.
The story of Jack O'Brien reminds us of the importance of service in World War I here and abroad, in particular in France. And it also reminds us of the importance of Australian war cemeteries, both at home and overseas.
A little-known Australian unit, the first Royal Australian Naval Bridging Train, was formed in February 1915 and sailed for overseas service in June with a strength of 300 men, mostly naval reservists, and more than 400 horses. En route to the Western Front, their plans were changed and the unit was instead destined for Gallipoli. The naval bridging train, minus their horses, landed under fire at Suvla on 7 August in support of a British offensive. Once ashore, their skills were in high demand. Their first major task was to build a pier. Casualties at Suvla were mounting quickly and lifeboats could not get within 100 yards of the shore. The naval bridging train swung into action, rowing pontoons ashore. They constructed a pier within 20 minutes. It was in use just 5 minutes later. Soon their role expanded to include a wide range of activities, from distributing stores and erecting dugouts and cookhouses. One of their most vital tasks was managing the supply of water to troops on shore, life-saving work in a scorching summer. The men constructed a pipeline supported by trestles, and the water was eagerly awaited by troops on shore. Based at what was known as Kangaroo Beach, the men were subject to shelling and aerial bombardment. The unit was led by 32-year-old Lieutenant Commander Leighton Bracegirdle, a career military man who had served in the Boxer Rebellion and the Boer War, and had been part of the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force in German New Guinea in 1914. As summer gave way to autumn and winter approached, storms engulfed Gallipoli, which made working and living even more challenging. Fierce gales smashed boats onto rocks, sickness rose in the unit, and a rising swell even threatened to overwhelm the commanding officer's dugout. In December, the naval bridging train had an important role to play in ensuring the smooth evacuation of British troops from Suvla. The men worked day and night constructing piers, assembling and disassembling huts and destroying pontoons and stores, until finally the last group of the unit left Suvla at 2 a.m. on the 18th of December. The naval bridging train's leader, Lieutenant Commander Leighton Bracegirdle, was awarded a mention in dispatches. He was proud of his men and the work they'd done. He wrote,
"These men, in most instances, had excellent training as apprentices to various trades in civil life, and, by reason of their years of training, both as senior naval cadets and as adult naval trainees, took pride in the fact that they were the only Australian naval unit serving in a European theatre of war. They were therefore bent on proving, both to the Royal Navy and the British Army, that they could overcome any difficulties."
You want to join us?
And so that's our look at Anzac Day and what's happened today. And Bill, an important day especially for the relatives of those 25 who were put on the memorial this morning.
Yes, indeed, Neil. Yes, indeed, Neil. We've honoured all that have served today, all those that have passed away, but we've embraced into the commemorative community, if you like, another 25 names who will now be forever remembered in their home state, and that's really important.
Absolutely. We've seen how important that is with their families and friends as well who came along to the service this morning. It's important we continue to commemorate all those who've served. So that does now conclude our coverage of Anzac Day here in Adelaide as we remember and honour the men and women who've served and are still serving our country in times of war and conflict and times of peace.
And stay with us now on the ABC TV for the dawn service from Gallipoli. We'll be crossing live, and that's followed by the commemorations in France at Villa Bretonneux. I'm Neil Cross. On behalf of Emma Rebolado and to the RSL Ambassador Bill Denny, thanks for joining us. Good afternoon from the Garden of Remembrance in Adelaide.